I'd like to welcome you to this Tradition Deep Dive hosted by the Contemplative Study Centre at the University of Melbourne. I'm Dr. Cullen Joyce, Insight Fellow at the Centre. So I'd like to begin our session today by acknowledging country. I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both from the past and the present, and of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians present today. So today we are joined by the Reverend Professor Austin Cooper, a church historian who lectures at Catholic Theological College, which is part of the University of Divinity. In this workshop, we will introduce the Christian nature mystical tradition, explore how contemplation is practiced in this tradition, and reflect on how our meditative experiences as we practice it. So in each of the three sections of the discussion, there'll be set aside some time for meditation and guided practice and some reflection. And then after these short meditations, we'll invite you to ask any questions you have on the content or the practices that we've done. So please note that this session will be recorded. So please keep your camera and microphone off if that is more comfortable for you, and feel free to post comments in the chat throughout the questions and any questions that you have there. So welcome, Austin.
Thank you very much, Colin, and it's very good to be with you on this lovely sunny winter afternoon in Melbourne. So today, yes, we are beginning this session on really what is, I suppose, best described as a natural approach to contemplation, an approach to contemplation through nature. And I'm going to use as my starting point the Franciscan tradition. And I just put up my PowerPoint for you to see, and that will help us to get that underway. Right, so here we are. Now, I do hope everybody can see that all right. Anybody, any problems?
That's fine, Austin.
Yes, okay, because I was just halfway through a lecture last week and one of the students said, we can't see anything of the PowerPoint. So a lot of my PowerPoint was lost. So not today, that's good. Right, I want to begin by introducing you, if you don't know him already, St Bonaventure, who was a follower of St Francis of Assisi. And Bonaventure takes up as his beginning point the love that Francis of Assisi had for nature. And I just want to quote a few of the phrases and sentences of the famous Canticle to the Sun, penned apparently by St Francis himself. Just look at the second stanza here. Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially so brother sun, who is the day through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. So it's a joyful hymn of praise to God for the sun, which reminds us of the reality of God. And so he goes on through this, and then he talks about all sorts of things. Praise be to God for wind and all air, and fair and stormy, all weather's moods, by which you cherish all that you have made. So he just revels really in the world about him, and he loves it in all its phases and in all its moods. And Bonaventure is not going to give any sort of commentary on that, but he uses that as a spirit and I think a starting point for his approach to spirituality in general. And he wrote a very lovely little work. There, by the way, is one of the images of St. Francis and the Canticle of the Sun. If you're interested in reading or praying through the whole of it, it's very easy to find on the internet, so I don't need to spend any more time on it. But there's a rather lovely likeness to Francis by an artist. Right. Another image that Bonaventure is going to use is the six-winged Serif, this very strange mystical being first mentioned by the prophet Isaiah in chapter 6. This is a Serif who is sort of the senior of the angels giving worship and praise to God. And of course, the six-winged seraph comes down to us both through the Christian and the Jewish tradition, and also, of course, through Islam. So the six wings gives Bonaventure the number 6. So he's not going to talk very much about the six-winged seraphs as such, but rather about the idea of 6. St. Francis himself had a mystical experience in which he saw a six-winged seraph, but the six-winged seraph was, as it were, united with Christ on the cross. So this is the way in which we give glory to God in the Christian tradition, in, with, and through Christ. And Christ is the one who enables us to go to the Father. You know, I am the way, the truth, and the life, Christ said. So Christ is central. So that's another idea, very central idea that Bonaventure takes up and which he develops in his little work that I'm going to introduce you to. So this is picking up all of these things and weaving them into a really very extraordinary piece of theological writing. I was just counting up the book I'm going to introduce you to, and I'm not going to give a commentary on it, is The Mind's Road to God, Itinerarium Mentis in Deum. Lovely title, The Mind's Road to God. And Bonaventure in this has a 6-stage process. And the 6 stages is divided into 3 lots of 2. On the bottom line, we can see vestiges of God in the world about us. A vestige is a sort of a footprint, if you like. And then going above that, we see God reflected in ourselves and, of course, in all human beings, who we're told in the Bible are made after the image and likeness of God. And then, having thought about or noticed the world about us, and having through introspection thought about ourselves and other human beings, then we can transcend and look above ourselves at God. So in the left-hand column, we go up this hierarchy of being, and we then come to God. On the right-hand side, this is actually the same thing repeated, but here it's repeated in terms of what we've been given through revelation. So at the bottom lung, we see the presence of God in the world, and particularly in the Christian tradition, we use ordinary things. We use bread and wine and oil and water and salt, sort of things you'd find in any kitchen. And they're used in sacraments. And sacraments are a way in which we go to God. That's been revealed to us through the tradition and through Scripture. Then when we go up and look at ourselves, we see ourselves reformed by grace. That is, through baptism, we are made members of the body of Christ. And then finally, we can see ourselves as part of the Trinity. Now, there's Bonaventure's 6 phrases, and he likens these also, not just to the 6 wings of the seraph, but also to the 6 days of creation. And what happened on the 7th day? God rested. And for Bonaventure, that represents the apex to which any human being can aspire in this life, in the journey to God. And that is what we might call mystical marriage in the language of St. Teresa of Avila. This is where we really pass over into, you know, a much deeper and more closer relationship with God. And we do virtually nothing there. Everything is given to us. So I think the beauty about Bonaventure is that he virtually says to us that here in the green part, we can approach God through so many different starting points. Today, I really want to just concentrate on the starting point of the world about us. So that is my beginning today. So
thank
I would like anybody who would like to ask me for any elucidations, or if there's anything I haven't made clear, please do. Interaction. I don't want to be just here, as it were, talking merrily to myself. So
Not at all,
more we
Austin.
have interaction and any signs of life are really very much appreciated.
I might just ask a question then. So the Franciscan outlook is, one of many that are possible within the Catholic tradition, at least. And so you've talked about the nature mysticism a little bit. So what is it that you think is most distinctive about this particular expression, this particular kind of energy that's evolving within the Franciscan expression?
Well, I think, for one thing, I think it's something that probably an awful lot of people do anyway. I'm inclined to think in this whole business of contemplation and so on, that a lot of people are doing things that they just don't put a name to. Because I've just presented all of this as our going to God. And that's true. It is. We are making our way to God. But there's a more fundamental thing, and that is that God is reaching out to us. In fact, in the mind's road to God, Bonaventure starts off with this beautiful phrase, "In the beginning, I call upon the first beginning, from whom all illuminations descend, as from the Father of lights, from whom comes every good and every perfect gift." That's beautiful. In other words, Bonaventure's reminding us that no matter how much we might be making our way to God, we are only making our way to God because God is first reaching out to us. And I often wonder, about very simple people who perhaps just do one of the things we're going to talk about today, and not be able to use a phrase like nature mysticism. In fact, if you said to them they were engaged in nature mysticism, they might get a bit of a fright and wonder what they're up to. But I think instinctively an awful lot of people see a beautiful part of the world, and somehow or other it is for them an invitation to and a meeting point with the mystery, which is all encompassing, the God in whom we live and move and have our being. Somehow or other they have the grace, the strength, the insight, the gift to be able to see that there's something beautiful here, but it is somehow or other beautiful in a wider beauty that they can't see, but they have a sense of that. So I'm just from my general talking with people, I think a lot of people do actually tumble to these things without actually putting words to them.
So, as I think sometimes a phrase comes to nature as the first book of Revelation. I can't remember if it's the first or second. But so nature has this kind of special expression of God's existence or God's life or love. So it becomes a kind of, so there's this kind of convergence both of the natural beauty, but also the supernatural beauty, would you say, Austin?
Yes, I think people have, and they may not even be able to put it in terms of, say, a supernatural beauty, but there's just something or other that they have a feeling of something other, something mysterious. Look, there was a very interesting survey done some years ago by a group called the Catholic the Christian Research Association in Melbourne. It's an ecumenical group, and they just do research into various aspects of the practice of religion. And some years ago, they did a survey of spirituality among young people. And I think they interviewed something like 1,500 or 2,000 young people. And about 60% of these young people said that when they sat and looked at mountains or at the water, the ocean, they had something like a religious experience. That's as far as they would go. But I think that's extraordinary. The young people who seem to be so, much on the go and so busy about so many things that so many actually have reflective moments.
And so what you're describing is that, of course, sometimes people don't have vocabulary or an experience that's informed by particularly Christian or religious vocabulary,
Yeah.
but there's definitely something happening there. But just to, I know, to bring it into some Christian language and to condense what you've been saying a little bit. So just to condense it, so what is it that nature, about nature, that provides that contemplative experience? To put it in those phrases, what is it about the natural world that kind of leads people into that contemplative experience?
I would think probably it's the fact that that it's almost an immediate, there's nothing else between them and God except this. It's not somebody else, what somebody else has said about God, or what somebody else has written about God, or some great work of art that somebody has conceived about God. Here, there is it seems to me, a direct and immediate connection, God, world, and me looking at it.
Can I work with that a little bit? Because St. Francis comes across as an extremely kind of authentic and not naive, is maybe not the right expression, but as a person who kind of dives into this type of immediate experience of nature and God. And so there's something about him as a figure that is so important here for expressing maybe what that contemplative experience is kind of echoing or about. Maybe that's not totally fair, but it does seem to, in many cases, that we're kind of working with an experience that he is also kind of very deeply involved in.
Yes, yes, undoubtedly. Yes, I think you're right.
So what is it about the Franciscan kind of energy that's so important to this engagement with contemplative practice within, I guess, subsequent, Christian or Catholic expressions?
Well, I think part of it must be surely due to St. Francis himself, who is a universally loved figure, don't forget. You know, anybody apparently who met him just saw he's a totally uncomplicated human being. There is a story told, you know, that he went on a journey to see, you know, what Islam was all about. And he thought that if he could tell the people of Islam about Christ, that they would, you know, be converted to Christ. I'm not sure whether this actually took place, but I think there's a truth in the story that it would just be his very, you know, simplistic view, but that they apparently welcomed him with great courtesy, though they didn't convert, but they could see this man as a thoroughly decent, uncomplicated human being. He wasn't up to any tricks. He wasn't trying to play, you know, any sort of games with them. He was just simply telling them what he saw as the truth. And that had about it a charm and a grace and an attractiveness all on its own. And I think Bonaventure, who was really a great thinker, and being able to compress all of this into a book of, you know, some 60 pages, and they're not very, there's big print in the version that I'm using, so it's really a very short work, but it's packed tight with insight. So I think this man could take all the simplicity of St. Francis and show and translate it into a very complex but unifying approach, which takes up, I think, all different aspects of an approach, because he's using not only Francis, he's also using St. Augustine, for instance, and he uses people like St. Anselm, the great theologian who was Archbishop of Canterbury just after the Norman invasion, those sort of people, and people of his own age. So, you know, he's weaving a whole lot of material into this, which shows an extraordinary ability to synthesize and put everything together. And I think that this is, you're getting two sides of the Christian thing. On the one hand, with Francis, it can be so utterly simple. But on the other hand, it has about it a great complexity and can be all-encompassing and really very, you know, very learned. So you get the best of both approaches here with Francis and Bonaventure. but we're only using them as a starting point.
Yes, it seems like that, you know, if we're not careful, there could be too much of one or the other. But it's a wonderful kind of, what you're saying here is that Bonaventure's expression is kind of coming out of almost the contemplation of the person of Francis, and as well as the vision that Francis has of the Serif. And so, do you think that there's something distinctive in the character of the Franciscans that kind of emerges out of Francis and Bonaventure that is kind of remains kind of connected to this nature experience, or this experience of mystical connection with nature?
Yes, well, one would hope that it is. Don't forget that at the time of Bonaventure, he was elected to be head of the Franciscan movement. And at this stage, they were already actually fragmenting. And it's one of the very sad things of history that the beautiful simplicity of Francis got somehow rather lost. And it was all about this whole question of poverty. Francis didn't want to own anything. Although he loved the world, he didn't want to have, didn't want to live in a posh house. He didn't want to have lots of things. In fact, he was quite happy with virtually nothing, just very, very simple life. So Franciscans were having a great deal of problems about how to translate this then into a movement which, had to have buildings to live in, and had all the sorts of complexities that come with living in an ever-evolving and developing society. How do you retain that sort of simplicity? So Bonaventure, through the Mind's Road to God, one of the great gifts of God that comes in contemplation is, of course, the gift of peace. And Bonaventure was engaged in a very, very complex, practical, pastoral problem of bringing peace to the various parts of the Franciscan movement. So, he sees all of this as not opting out into a world of one's own, but very much an effort to try and solve the problems of the moment.
So, I mean, we don't want to get too bogged down into I mean, I'm kind of familiar with some of the early Franciscan tradition, but it's quite complex. But it's, as you say, like the attempt to bring this concern for peace and connectedness into practice. And so, I mean, I don't want to again put you on the spot too much, but how do you feel like the maybe post Francis, and how this mystical experience of nature can remain kind of a central concern to the Christian contemplative tradition after this? What is it that's allowing this kind of continual connection to nature to be retained within the tradition?
Well, I think it's retained within in the Christian tradition as a whole. Let me just mention very briefly 3 ways in which I think it's being maintained. I would think that when we come to look at the world, one of the things that we can learn something from is the tradition of Australian Aborigines. And in this, all I want to say is this: I would recommend anybody who wants to get a grasp of a Christian attitude towards Aborigines and the world they lived in could do no better than to look at a very short speech by Pope John Paul II, which he gave to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders when he was in Australia in the 1980s. I think it was 1986. He gave a speech at Alice Springs. I would highly recommend that. Could I just leave that at that and not, we don't need to develop that anymore? Because I think we can learn an awful lot from what the Pope is pointing out about an Aboriginal approach. The second thing, you mentioned Pope Francis. Look, I think his record on, Laudato Si, his encyclical, is just so beautiful. I reread it earlier this year, and I thought, oh gosh, I'll have to come back again to this, a third time, sometime. So I think that he's done some wonderful things there to remind us that we do have a duty of care to God's first revelation. Before there was a church, before there was a Bible, God revealed himself in the world we believe he created and sustains.
Mm.
So I think Pope Francis has done some wonderful things there, but also he's been greatly helped by other church leaders, not least by the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, who has published quite a large amount of material on the, if you like, the spirituality of ecology. And so, you know, here is a very wide spectrum of approaches: Aboriginal, Australian, the Pope of the day, and the Patriarch of Constantinople of the day. Well, I mean, you could hardly say that this is just a sideline to Christianity. It's, you know, very much a responsibility.
Well,
It goes back to Genesis. We were told that, you know, we had to look after the land and till it, don't care for it.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. It's quite a, you know, as you say, there's a large breadth of kind of showing that the continual connectedness. So just in that spirit, I wondered if you'd like to lead us in the first kind of guided practice of meditation. If
I would, and one of the things that I would just like to recommend is, I think the first thing I really going to suggest is just simply this: to notice something. Some years ago, I was picked up a very distinguished and learned and refined man at the airport who was our guest. And I was driving him home, and coming home, I drove, it was autumn, and I drove down a street I'm very fond of, where the autumn leaves form an arch over the street. And we were, the two of us, having a great conversation. And I suddenly said, "Isn't this extraordinary?" And he said, "What?" I thought he'd see immediately that this wasn't part of the conversation we were having, that I was talking about the trees above us, which had this gold. We were all driving down through a golden archway. It was just absolutely stunning. He hadn't noticed it out of the corner of his eye. Well, here in this picture, I love this picture. I found it some years ago, and there are more classy ones. The next one is much more classy. I think, but I like this one because, you know, different people notice different things, don't they? Somebody with a spray can noticed that there was a spare bench here that he could, you know, get to work on. Presumably the lady is noticing the beauty of the surrounding thing. So look, I'm just going to ask people if to think about something that you've noticed. Is there some place, some point, is there something you come back to where somehow or other you get something that's special? I'm going to put it in very vague things in the hopes that people will be able to respond in different ways. So could we sit with this lady for a while and not be too distracted by the spray can efforts, but just look at this and absorb this picture. And okay, is that all right, Colin?
That's fine, Austin. So we'll take a few minutes and just to, if everyone could kind of take a meditation, and after we've finished the reflection, we'll come back for comments and questions a little bit.
Thank you.
So Austin, that this probably we've only had a couple of minutes, but it might be an opportunity to ask if anyone has any reflections or questions to provide.
I notice we have a couple of points in the chat box. Should we deal with those?
Oh, they're comments more than anything.
Okay, okay, good. Right.
Just in the next 5 minutes, has anyone got a question or a comment that they would like to contribute? And it'd be nice to maintain the quieter space as well from now. Oh, there's Gwen has a question. Gwen, please unmute yourself and ask if you feel.
It's more of a comment, but obviously requesting a reflection back. The experience which I had a little bit of looking at the picture, but get much more when I'm not looking at a picture, but I'm in nature, is remembering that I myself am part of nature. In a very real sense, that the oxygen I breathe comes from the trees that I can see, that the flowers are signaling to me as much as to anybody else with the communications that they're putting out there. The effect of the skin, of the wind on my skin, is no different from the effect of the wind on plants and leaves and other things. So it sort of, in a sense, leads up to your second level, I think, which is that for me, one of the channels of noticing things is being reminded of something about my own nature, which is that I am actually part of nature in a very unmediated way.
Yes, look, thank you so much for that. Towards the end, I'm going to recommend a book which was just published last year by an American scientist who does come to this same view, which I agree wholeheartedly what you say. And she actually comes to it also substantiated by her research on the human brain. It's a very fascinating book, and it's. I just read one review of it. The only review I could find on the internet said, well, we could have contemplation without worrying about religion. I think that her research actually substantiates the approach of the centuries of people who have been saying this very thing, that we are part and parcel of the world about us. I think it's a very real thing to be able to experience it firsthand. Yeah, that world and our dependence, and not only our dependence but also our responsibility to look after it. Yeah, it all forms a sort of this doctor. Her name is Lisa Miller, Millar. She uses the word fabric, which is beautiful, isn't it? That we all form this one fabric. Yeah, all interwoven together. Yes. Thank you for that comment.
Thank you, Anne. Go on. Oh, and Pauline has a question as well. Unmute yourself, Pauline, to ask. Just unmute. You're right.
Yes.
Here we go.
Sorry. Thank you, Cullen. Yes, I think it's a very beautiful image. I'm actually rather distracted by the woman on the seat. Firstly, she doesn't. To me, she's an observer. She's not a participant in the scene. She has her head tilted and her legs crossed, and she's enjoying it, but I'm not sure that she's immersed in it. My sense if I was standing there, or perhaps sitting, I think there's a great mysticism in that whole image because, well, there is mist, or there appears to be mist anyway, and it's at a great height. And I think when we're involved in height and nature, for me, it brings me closer to God, and that kind of sense of awe that is usually indescribable, but very much soul embracing, I think, with a lot of wonder there, because it takes me beyond the nature, even into another hemisphere somehow. So they're my observations, I guess.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Pauline. Yes, I've been visiting this lady for so long now in this photograph, so I don't really know what she's thinking, but I just always assumed, I do hope she didn't put the graffiti on the back of the seat. I do hope that she's really focused on the beauty of the place rather than, yes, thank you.
And that does lead us really well into the next part of the discussion.
Yes. Good, thank you.
So just to, in this part of the section, we'll start to talk a little bit around what we might call a contemplative experience. Yes. And some of the things that Pauline has mentioned and Grain has mentioned too is kind of helping us with this. And you had at different stages too, Austin, also talked about this kind of conversational or personal relationship between persons. And so you can talk about how, Christian contemplative practice is not really, it's not always helped by using the term like a technique. So could you talk a little bit about why the term technique could be problematic for understanding this approach to kind of contemplative experience?
Yeah, well, I think, well, it sounds, I think, if you use techniques, and there are books about, methods of prayer and all the rest, but I tend to be a little bit sort of suspicious about them. I do like this, and I want to introduce people to this guy. If you haven't met him already, it's B. Griffiths. He was a student at Oxford and a student of C.S. Lewis, and they remained lifelong friends. He became a Benedictine monk and took the name Bede, which stayed with him. Now, that wasn't his original Christian name. He spent the greater latter part of his life in India, where he was very close to Hindu practices and Hindu mystics. So he really stretches our ecumenical vision in another direction other than just towards the Judeo-Christian tradition or Christians and Islam. But he explains this in this piece of his biography. And he talks about, it was his last year at school, so he was a comparatively young man. He might have been 16 or 17. And he came out and he saw the beauty of nature. I won't read the whole thing, it might take a bit too long, but if we could just take it up the last 6 or so lines. A lark rose suddenly from the ground beside the tree by which I had been standing and poured out its song above my head and then sank, still singing, to rest. Everything then grew still as the sunset faded and the veil of dusk began to cover the earth. I remember now the feeling of awe which came over me. I felt inclined to kneel on the ground as though I had been standing in the presence of an angel, and I hardly dared to look on the face of the sky because it seemed as though it was but a veil before the face of God. Isn't that beautiful for a young man to write at school when he was at school? I must confess to something like that happening to me. I was brought up in Sorrento, and I remember one day riding my bike down towards the pier, down the hill. You can't go down the hill now, it's a one-way street only coming up. So I got off my bike. Where I got off my bike actually is now covered in 6 or 7 feet of earth because they built a helipad right there. I remember sort of standing there, I think I was about 11 or 12 at the time, and looking across to Arthur's Seat. And I stood there for quite some time, and I was just sort of stunned by beauty. But I'd seen it thousands of times before. We live within a stone's throw of it. And it's just amazing that this was so. And I didn't have a word like awe to use. I wish I had. But I said thank you to God. And somehow or other, even before I came across people like Bonaventure many years later, I sort of stumbled to the fact that I could be at peace when I was among trees and shrubs and in gardens and things. So I think I mentioned this not as a great, mystical experience or anything, but I think people tumble to things. And I say it that way because it's more truthful to say that I think God is reaching out to us in all sorts of stages of life. There's one stage of prayer life, for instance, called the prayer of quiet. I'm very sure that some of the people I know experience the prayer of quiet, but they wouldn't have that name to put on it, and they wouldn't even know perhaps how to express it very well. But I'm very sure that that's the first stage of St Teresa's, deeper movement into the mystery of the interior castle. So what we're talking about is only something that we understand and can write about and can explain. The deeper thing is that God is there reaching out to us. And I've been very helped in all of this by this Jewish philosopher, I and thou, Martin Buber. It's a lovely little book. I reread it in preparation for giving this presentation. Buber says that we all relate to different things and different people, and we can relate to them as I and it. I might meet somebody and I might say, oh, now this guy is going to be useful to me in my work. To somehow or other, he is perhaps just an it, a thing, something useful. Martin Buber says, though, that in all our relationships, both to people and to places and to things, we need to have an I-thou relationship. And of course, the only way to do that is not to pretend that a tree is a human being and we're going to love it in exactly the same way, not at all, but to see that everything somehow is related to an interpersonal relationship, and that is our relationship with God. So he actually uses the example on one page of a relationship to a tree. A tree can be just a nit. I might see it as a useful wind break for my house, or I might see it, or if I could cut it down, I could make so many splendid bookshelves out of it or whatever. Now, Martin Buber says that it must be an I-thou relationship that is caught up in this whole mystery of a personal relationship with God. And that I think makes an awful lot of sense. So this elevates our looking, it seems to me, our looking at the world about us, not just simply as a beautiful thing, even though we might be very closely related to it, but as something which is caught up with interpersonal relationships. And I think it's at that point that it becomes prayer. So, and I think, if I was rephrasing my juvenile experience, I think I should have said, oh, you're so very kind. What's that? That's praise, isn't it? That's awe. I should have said, thank you. This is just so good for me. I'm so grateful to be here. But I think, even just in saying thank you, I think there's a very great depth of prayer. And I think when I do see something beautiful, I do try to say thank you to God. I had the practice. I used to often go to work on the tram. I haven't for the last few years, but I used to get out off the tram at Jolimont and walk through the Fitzroy Gardens. And I'd always stop sometime and say out loud the psalm, the heavens proclaim the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth the work of his hands. I think we need to actually mouth and to say and to pray the prayer in and with and through nature. I really do think that we've got to make it deeply personal. And I think the Fitzroy Gardens are just absolutely stunning. So I always try to thank God for it. I also thank God for the person who actually organised it and planned it. He also deserves our very great gratitude. So, you know, it's not just us and things, it's all the time us and others in a ever deepening personal relationship. So here's another quote from Bede Griffiths. I'm very fond of Bede Griffiths. He's quite a remarkable character, and he deserves to be remembered. He died a few years ago. He was a very old man, but he'd been to Australia from India at least a couple of times that I know of. Right. Here is another person that I'm very, very fond of. This is Hildegarde Bingham. This is one of her little hymns. I don't know whether you know her music, but it's absolutely captivating. And they're all written in Latin, of course, but here is this, and this perhaps sums it up. The Holy Spirit is life that gives life, moving all things. So the Holy Spirit is at work in a gnat as well as in a whale, in a tiny plant as in a mighty oak tree, as in a human being, though in a different way there. It is the root in every creature and purifies all things, wiping away sins, anointing wounds. It is radiant life worthy of praise, awakening and enlivening all things. I think that's a wonderfully inspiring piece of spirituality, which encompasses the whole of creation.
Thank you, Austin, and I think this kind of conversational relationship between persons and that you're describing, it's sometimes, it does really beautifully illustrate some of the tensions around seeing contemplation as something of a practice or as a technique or as something that it's just kind of flowing out of life and the connection, because just sometimes, of course, you know, a conversation goes well, or sometimes it doesn't always go as well. And but I think what I was struck with also in what you're describing before is that there's still a little bit of this tension between the immediacy of the experience, but also as you start to reflect on it, sometimes it's changing it, and you end up, you know, you're not necessarily, you end up having to, in a sense, complicate the things a little bit more than you might like. But I felt like, so when we're talking about this kind of connection and experience of God and this conversation with persons, and something of that you evoke with St. Francis. So what do you think then is this really what the core experience that the tradition is seeking, or is this part of what the experience of the tradition, or is it just part, or is it's kind of central to the whole of Christian nature mysticism?
Well, this interpersonal relationship is central, I think, to the whole of Christian spirituality, isn't it? And I think that one of the things about this is that we might start, for instance, with our prayer with a quote from the Bible, and that surely should lead us into a deeper personal relationship in the Spirit with the Lord. And so I think this is one of the things I think is so beautiful about Bonaventure. I think in those 6 ways, he's saying you can start from anywhere, and anywhere, if you go the right direction, it ends up in a deeper awareness of the mystery of God.
I might take you back to that Bible just so quickly to one of the things that I think you're describing in relationship to the quote from the Bible is that what's coming along with the expression of the Bible is, of course, it's God's communication with humanity in the world. And so this idea then that perhaps, and this is me trying to expound a little bit, so like that in the quote from the Bible, it's something of that voice, of that relationship speaking to us in a very specific kind of scriptural passage, and it gives this evocation of a person, of a very substantial person, or that we're in conversation with a little bit. And so was that kind of what you're describing in relationship to the prompting from Scripture? Is that what you're trying to get
yes,
at?
I think, one of the great ways of approaching prayer is through Lectio Divina, which is the Benedictine way of approaching prayer. That is, we read the Scriptures, or indeed any other greatly inspirational piece of work. We read it slowly and meditatively. As C.S. Lewis says, it's more like sucking a lozenge rather than eating a slice of bread. You let it sort of gradually melt itself, as it were, into your being. But don't forget that this stems, the Lectio Divina stems from the Benedictine thing. And the Benedictine rule starts with a very strong Latin word, absculta, and it means listen very carefully. You can't translate it into by one word into English. Listen very carefully with the ear of your heart. Don't just hear things with your ear, but actually absorb them with all your abilities to take on board the reality about you. And in chapter 48 of the Rule of St Benedict, where Benedict says that we must have Lectio Divina, he's also saying that we've got more time in the winter, because they were farmers, we've got more time to give to Lectio Divina. In other words, you listen to the seasons of the world, and your prayer is all about this reacting to the reality of the seasons, going back to letting the wind and the sun and all the rest of it, impinge upon you. I think Christianity's been pretty much alive to all of these things and moving us from any starting point to a deeper personal friendship with the Lord. And I would think myself that if we're going to hand the faith on to coming generations, it's going to be through things like this, rather than the more legalistic approach to what we must do or mustn't do. Not that there are things that we must or mustn't do. I mean, there are, obviously, but in terms of stress or the framework or the language with which we address things. I don't know what you think, but as I think about the rampant secularism that we're all surrounded with, something like what I've got up there now from Hildegarde Bingham is just so contrary to all of that, isn't it? Where that there is a spirit at work in all things and in all places, and it's an enlivening, an encouraging, a productive, a deeply loving sort of spirit that's at work. And somehow or other to show people that all of that is taking place is a massive challenge, I find. But I'm wondering.
Look, let's I mean, I think it's led us to some beautiful things. So at this time now, we've got another little space for reflection, Austin. Would you like to? I mean, we've covered a lot in the last 20 minutes, but would you like to provide a prompt for the second?
Yes,
space?
I would. By the way, there's looking across the bay to to Arthur's Seat. Isn't that gorgeous? It's not exactly the place where I began from. Right. Okay. Well, look, I just want to put in here at one stage. That is the whole idea of starting from nature, which we're here at. And when we say nature, I think here that we could put in everything that human beings are doing that's good. Because we're all dealing with somehow or other with the world, aren't we? So I think a nuclear scientist or a nurse or any other could start from that bottom left-hand corner. But there's also another thing, that is in chapter 2, which is a very short chapter, Bonaventure mentions contemplating God in his vestures in the sense world. God is actually in the world in a very special way. And that which has the character not only of a sign in the general sense, but also of a sacrament. There's a real presence, and the Catholic tradition has used that word real presence in a very specific, very clear, very consistent way regarding Eucharist. That somehow or other in this very ordinary, simple thing, wine and bread, fruit of the earth and work of human hands, that God is present there. I love this as a starting point from sacrament. I love this. This is Salvador Dali's Last Supper. As you know, in his latter years, he reverted to his Catholic faith. And here he takes up, this is the Last Supper, but it's also, I think, reminding us of baptism. I see the white garb that each of those, the apostles, has as a symbol of the sacramental, the baptismal garb that we're given at baptism. We're all one in Christ. It enables us to be here in this breakthrough between the physical world and the world of mystery. And the breakthrough comes with Christ on the cross. You see the Christ stretched out on the cross above, but it's also the risen Christ. And the power of that death and resurrection are made real for us, present for us, not repeated, but the power of them, their undying power, is made present to us here at this place, at this time. And what you see in the background actually is the bay where Salvador Dali spent his youth. So the reality of the great scriptural truths, the reality of the liturgy, converge with this place and enable me through this mystery to be in touch with the unseen world. And, well, basically it enables the unseen world to reach out and touch me here in this time and this place by a power of something which is timeless and universal. I think it's stunningly beautiful. I don't know what you think about it. Not everybody likes Salvador Dali, but I just think this is breathtaking. So here, you know, is another start from nature, because we're starting with ordinary things, and we're moving on to something far deeper. Fruit of the earth and work of human hands. So just let's then take up something for, look, I really do feel that one of the things that we can hope to experience as we spend time. Did I mention earlier Jennifer Roberts of Harvard University? Did I? I did.
Oh no, not yet.
Oh no, oh haven't I? Good. Look, I only stumbled across her quite by accident. She's a professor of fine arts at Harvard University, and the first assignment that she gives to every student, undergraduate and postgraduate, is to go to a gallery and pick a great work of art and to sit before it for 3 hours and then to write down their impressions. See, one of the things I think is that we might go there and sit on that seat with that lady and say, gosh, this is great, isn't it? Yeah, oh, that's terrific. And then off we go, you know, to do something more exciting. We're not given to the discipline of letting, not just seeing, oh, isn't that beautiful, but of spending the time to where we can get to the point where it's not just that I think this is beautiful and I'm loving it and enjoying it, no, but getting to the point where actually this enthralls me. And I think there's a breakthrough has to come with that. I don't think it happens just automatically. And I think the breakthrough comes with those fruit of the Spirit that you get in St Paul's letter to the Galatians. But the fruit of the Spirit is love. You know, do you really feel a little bit less angry with somebody, a little bit less annoyed? Joy. Is your faith in the mystery a springboard for joy? Is it good news? Peace, the great quest of Bonaventure. Patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I just wonder, do we need to learn a discipline of actually spending prolonged time? It may not be 3 hours, but you know, quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, whatever. And comes the point, I think, where we get itchy and want to say, oh, let's pass on to something more exciting. Surely if we drive another kilometre, there'll be an even more stunning view than this one. No, but it won't be any, it might be more stunning, but it won't necessarily be any better because it's the gift of the same giver. It can still introduce us to the mystery. It's only an introduction. It's not the final end. It's not the terminus. So I think there comes sort of a discipline, a break. St John of the Cross would have called it dark night of the senses. You know, and so I just leave this with you for what it's worth. But I do think that while I can't say, look, I'm a frightfully patient chap because I've spent all this time. Not at all. I think we've all got a lot to learn and a lot to, we're not finished in the making yet. We're still being created in the likeness of God. But I think that all of us know something of some of these gifts, however small it might be, that somehow or other God is reaching out to us through this place, in this place, in things or in sacraments to make us better. So should we have our few minutes of quiet, Cullen?
Yes, that would be good, John. Austin, we'll do have a few minutes there. Would you like to just, so you're happy for us to be reflecting on a place?
I think, well, look, I think that those words that St. Paul gives us, any one of them that we might find is, we need to have special concern about today because of, you know, where we are and who we are and the pressures that are on us and all the rest of it.
Good.
I just suggest that quietly.
Well, let's take a few minutes, and after that we'll come back with some questions and reflection. So we'll have a chance in the next part of the discussion to bring some more reflections. But if anyone has any questions or comments at the moment, please. Biddy has commented, it is easy to feel the sacredness of nature, in particular after we have seen a favourite beauty spot devoured by bushfire. But what do Christians owe to singular non-human beings or a tree? So what's owed to, in a sense, to creation? Is that right, Biddy? Are you happy with that expression?
Yeah, fine. Or indeed any other questions that have arisen out of. If I haven't been clear about anything, do please ask me for clarification. I don't want to.
I think maybe on Biddy's behalf, I feel like I mean, maybe we can also reflect on this a bit later, but what do you feel like is a Christian response to the destruction of kind of native places or country, and what's a kind of maybe evolving out of the contemplative experiences that we've been discussing today? What's kind of a way that a Christian responds to the effects that are or changes that happen to natural places through human or non-human interventions, through pollution, for instance? Is that okay to comment on, Austin?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's fine. Or do you want me to comment, or just anybody?
Oh, Biddy asked the question in the chat just about
yes, okay,
how
good.
would you respond?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Well, look. Yes. First of all, I think that the world has been given to us, and we have to make use of it. Obviously, we have to use. We have to mine certain things from the earth. But, do we really have to leave the earth in an awful mess after we've mined it? That's, I think, I'm just amazed at when I first went to Britain as a student, I remember thinking the ugliness of those slag heaps, around industrial areas. Couldn't something have been done to, to re-beautify the place if we had to take out coal? In those days, that coal was the big thing. Of course, producing power and heat and all the rest of it. So I think that we do have a responsibility to make sure that the earth is used in a very careful way. It's very interesting, isn't it, how some people learned this. In England, oak trees had to be set in certain plantations at a certain distance so that the beams would grow out in a nice curve, which would be useful for making bows of ships. Now, that seems to me to be a very sensible thing. And then when, you cut down one tree, well, you planted another, you didn't just destroy them. So that seemed to me to be a very, sensible and useful way of dealing with things. But I think it's just a very great pity when you see the world just used, and really used in a sense that one might almost say it's abused. It's maltreated and not treated with the respect that it's due. And I just think it's a part of our spirituality, really, to make sure we that whole movement, say, of Tidy Australia, those sort of movements are marvellous, actually, for doing something to exercise our real responsibility to take care of things. But we do, sadly, just belong to a throwaway generation, don't we? And more junk is accumulating, which doesn't seem to have very much certainly not much beauty, and
I think
a great deal of.
Well, I think and Gwaine has also made some comments too, and I think it will go. It's something maybe we can also bring some toward the end of the conversation, because I think Biddy was also talking about the sense that nature has an intrinsic value, which is, of course, about not having a value just in relationship to human life and use, but also of a sense of its being something of a person, that its own kind of integrity. So let's come back to that a little bit. But I think that if we can, we'll talk a little bit more about the contemplative practices, and that will also bring in some of the senses of that we've been discussing. And maybe we'll leave a little bit more time for questions and comments toward the end. Is that all right, everyone?
All
right. And so, but look, I do, yeah. Let's. I think you know, Biddy is raising some really good points. So. Can we, just to talk a little bit, Austin, when we're talking about the conversation with nature and this kind of relation between persons, and we're talking about how an aspect of Christian contemplative practice in your expression is kind of so natural, but it evolves kind of out of this natural response, but it also over time it involves, you know, we start to reflect a little bit on what is going on for us, and we start to describe what's happening in our experience. And you talked about how, you know, through this process of sitting in front of an artwork, is that over time you have to move through or sit with something, even if you want to move on to something else, and just be with an experience for longer than perhaps that you kind of wanted to. And so that's bringing up some elements connected to contemplative practice, and how a person might kind of know a little bit about how their practice is going. And I think that the quote from Galatians there is actually also really good to give us a sense of what we might expect from, you know, to experience while we're meditating. But if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what are some of the signs that a kind of a contemplative practice, or your engagement in you know, conversation with the world is going well, and what are some signs perhaps that your kind of connection is struggling, or that that something's not working within, say, your contemplative experience? Can you comment on that a bit?
Yeah, look, I'd go back to one thing that I get from St Teresa, who's always so sensible and so practical. In the first 3 mansions of the interior castle, Teresa brings us to the point where we do struggle with distractions and all the sorts of things that can take us away from God. But the overarching point that she's making, seems to me, is that we stick it with it. And I think that means that we do just simply do that we decide that what we ought to do is, say, have 20 minutes a day given to this sort of practice. Well, we ought to stick with it. Not just when we feel like it, not just when there's nothing more exciting to do, not when we're not too busy. No, we just stick with it. And I think that's, it seems to me that's the sort of thing that you get across the board. No use doing, physiotherapists give you some exercises, no use doing it just when you feel, you know, excited about exercise. No use doing it just when you feel, oh, what a lovely day it is, I think I'll do my exercises. No, you stick with it. It's just a bit of common sense. And I think it's the same here. And that's why I think that inevitably sticking with it brings us up against the sort of discipline that's needed, and the attitudes that we need to train ourselves to, really, just to be faithful. Because in the end, it's not just me sticking to this practice, it's me being faithful to a friendship. I don't just, you know, talk to my friend or friends when, oh, I feel like it today, so I'll, you know, ring up somebody and chat, or we'll go out to lunch with somebody. No, look, friendship's a thing you work at. Not just when it's useful, but you work at it. And I think that daily grind doesn't have to be excessive, doesn't have to be a holy hour or something like that. That's good if you can do it, but it's what you can do reasonably, and to stay with it. And I think it provides, therefore, its own discipline as it's needed. You know, so that's my experience.
So, and also when we are doing some of these reflections as well, like we're on the various, you know, aspects of a particular place, and sometimes these experiences and these reflections might have brought up potentially some troubling things for us. I know that when I was young, like I used to go out to our backyard. We used to look over onto a beautiful marshland, and when I was about 15, the marshland was pulled down for houses, and so although there was something about that experience for me which was beautiful, there's also this tinge of difficulty sometimes. And so how do you feel like is a good way of, you talked about the persistence a little bit, but how do you feel like it's good to navigate the various types of experiences that may occur as you're practicing? How do you place those? Sometimes the troubling, sometimes the positive. How do you place the different things together, Austin, do you feel?
Well, I suppose one thing is that one might be able to work out oneself what one should do. But I think also that if a difficulty is really quite serious and sort of seems to be, you know, a very serious block, I think then it's time to discuss it with somebody and ask for help. And that can come in all sorts of ways. Lots of people do go to a spiritual director or whatever, or one may talk to a friend about it if it's something that you feel, you know, you could share with somebody. I think it's very, very good to reach out for help. I think one of the big things, for instance, that's happened during the COVID thing, we got all sorts of rules and regulations about COVID, but I'm not sure that governments actually faced up to the amount of mental health problems that were growing and the pressure that people were under. Imagine being on the 12th floor of a high-rise flat building, you know, and cooped up for weeks on end. I mean, it must have been very, very strenuous, mustn't it, for a whole lot of people? And I think in those situations, people would probably need to talk to somebody about it. In other words, I think we have to be sensible enough to reach out for help when help's needed.
Yep, and
that sort of answer, one can't deal with all the possibilities that might crop up, but I think people have the nous to know whether, well, look, I can navigate around this, I can deal with this, or, well, I really should talk to somebody about it.
Well, the Christian practice of spiritual direction plays a, you know, sometimes that role is fulfilled in other ways by different faith traditions and contemplative faith traditions. But it is good naming that the Christian tradition has a way of engaging with these types of challenging experiences through the practice of spiritual direction. So thank you very much for that, Austin.
Yeah,
so
the spiritual direction is, you know, in a broad sense. I know that I have great respect for, and I know a lot of people who've been helped, say, by Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, where they can talk, people can talk to others and find a great deal of support, apparently. So that, you know, there are, as you say, various ways of, you know, putting it in a vertical spiritual direction. Yeah, good.
Now, just we're running a bit short on time, so I'd like to try to leave a bit of space for questions because we weren't able to get to all the comments and questions before. So at this time, we'd had a little bit of space for reflection, but we have come out of the previous one fairly quickly. Austin, would you like to, we wanted to have the last short reflection on something. We'll spend a couple of minutes here and we'll spend a little bit more time after this reflection. We'll spend a bit more time devoted to questions and answers, so that will give us a chance of Graeme and Biddy's comments to come back in.
Good. Look, I'd like to just share with you this bit of from Hildegarde Bingham, because I think she brings us back to where, you know, we are part of this fabric of the world. And, she talks about hardness of heart. I won't read the whole thing, but pick up to halfway down, just gives you the tone. Hardness of heart is saying, if I became involved with other people, just for a little in other people's affairs, what use would it be to me? And even if I did, I would do them neither harm nor good. I could go around feeling pity for everyone and everything, but I wouldn't get a moment's peace. And what would become of me? What kind of life would I lead if I have to find an answer for every voice of joy or sadness? I know only that I myself exist and everybody else should do the same. Again, I heard a voice from the cloud and it spoke. And it was mercy speaking. What are you saying, you creature of stone? Echoes of the book of Ezekiel. The plants give off the fragrance of their flowers. The precious stones reflect their brilliance to others. Every creature yearns for a loving embrace. The whole of nature serves humanity, and in this service offers all her bounty. But you have not even merited full human form. All you are is a pitiless stare, an evil cloud of smoke in the darkness. But I am a soothing herb. I dwell in the dew and in the air and in all greenness. My heart fills to overflowing, and I give help to others. I was there when the first words resounded, let there be. From these words, the whole of creation issued forth, which stands today at the disposal of humanity. But you are excluded. With a loving eye, I observe the demands of life and feel myself a part of all. I lift up the brokenhearted and lead them to wholeness, since I am the balm of every pain, and since my words ring true, while you remain what you are, a bitter cloud of smoke. Pretty harsh in one way, but also very reassuring, isn't it? That somehow or other, if we do play our part in the whole fabric. And I just want to leave you with that book by Lisa Miller, where she says, that what she wants for her family is to, we just pick it up here, we can go chasing goals and rewards, that is regarding everything as a it, lost in worries and regrets, or we can awaken to the true fabric of the world, an evolving tapestry that we both behold and help create. Isn't that beautiful? In which every thread matters and no strand stands alone. We can live in isolation, or we can awaken to the common knowing and communication among all living things, and to a deeper alignment with the source of consciousness. So there you are.
Thank you, Austin, and thank you, Gwen and Biddy. And I might ask you a question. I think, and if I get this one incorrectly, sometimes the idea of stewardship and the idea also of contemplation can seem a bit detached and seem to set humanity apart from nature a little bit, and to somewhat even some of Hildegarde's terms seem to make that separation a little bit. And so sometimes the Christian tradition has been credited with providing a structure of separation that allows there to be an extractivist relationship to the earth. So how do you feel the Christian mystical nature tradition can actually restore in a sense the proper connection, or a healthy relationship to the natural world without that kind of exploitative tone of that sometimes comes with stewardship language? Okay.
Well, look, I think if you take any of the great Christian mystics, they are absolutely and totally dependent upon the world around them. Let's take Teresa of Avila. She was the most observant woman, very practical woman. All her images are taken from nature, all of them. The 4 ways of getting water, for instance, to water a garden. Look, she saw all of that, and she was, deeply impressed by it, fascinated by it, impressed by it. So I don't think that there's any disjunction between the Christian mystical tradition at its best and the world about us. I think it's very much immersed in it, enriched by it, and growing out of it and growing through it to a very real similar attachment to the unseen world. If we can't appreciate the seen world, we might not appreciate the unseen world. We learn the art of appreciation by learning what's at our fingertips. We go on from there to appreciate the unseen, the mysterious, and the beauty of God.
And to the point of, caring for it quite actively, like a form of an
Oh,
active
indeed.
love.
Yes, 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 very much so. Yeah.
I think that's something good. So we've only got a couple minutes. I hope that I represented Gawain and Biddy's questions and comments a little bit. So look, I think that what we might do then is I think we're just about, really just about out of time. But if anyone has any more questions or comments, I'd like you to invite you to post these on the chat and to find some way so we can maintain the conversation. But look, Austin, thank you so much for, we didn't really, in a sense, have enough time to cover all the different things we could have talked about, but I feel like you've given us a wonderful representation of not just the Franciscans, but also the general kind of core elements of the Christian nature mystical tradition. So I'd like to thank you for today, and I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us. I'd like to invite everyone to subscribe to our newsletter, but also to feel free to contact us regarding any questions or comments related to the material you've had today. So look, thank you, Austin, and please, I'll invite you to say goodbye to everybody if you'd like.
Yes, well, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Very nice to be with you, and I, needless to say, I do get a great thrill out of talking about these matters and helping people in any way I can to appreciate the beauty of our tradition, really, very much, and its practical value.
Thank you so much, Austin.
Goodbye and God bless.
Goodbye. Thank you.